And I'm just going to turn this guy off. Heat.
They're very noisy, these air conditioners.
I know. It's like a constant battle, I think, with air conditioners and people who have weird sounds. And with the big rooms sometimes, they have weird echoes. People are actually putting like pillows in the strangest places of the rooms. You wouldn't believe it. It's crazy.
I mean, this idea that you can take out the bits of the sound you don't like if you have a system that is boomy or whatever, it doesn't really work. You remove a lot of aspects of it that you do want. Yeah. Because damping is pretty stupid. It doesn't know the difference.
Here we go. Season 10, Episode 2, the occasional podcast, part of the PTA network. We have a new studio and a new season for you. I just wanted to share with you, first off, something unverified from the internet that I found quite interesting this week. According to a random post that I saw on Facebook, the bell in decibel is for Alexander Graham Bell, since the capital B in lowercase b dB, the dB we see all the time, is a name-derived unit. It is capitalized when abbreviated. So the reason there's a lowercase d and then an uppercase B is because it's named after Alexander Graham Bell. Mystery solved. Boy, I've written that so many times and I've said, it's a little odd. Just kidding, I've never done that. But interesting fact nonetheless. On today's show, Peter Qvortrup of Audio Note. Peter has a lot to say on the audio front, but he has a lot to say on a lot of subjects. So just so you guys know, as you listen to the interview, he kicks it off with some off-subject stuff, but he does dive into all the interesting insights and thoughts he has on audio, which I find to be quite unique to him, which is very good to get a lot of different perspectives on a lot of different things. But just so you know, right off the bat, he does talk a little bit off subject. And I just decided for this interview to keep things as they were. So you're getting a largely unedited take on what our conversation was like. But just when you start out, you get about 8 minutes or so of off topic stuff before we dive right into the audio technicalities. But once there, we simmer, we brew, and we get a lot of interesting observations and a kind of a different way to think about audio and some of the takes that we talk about in HiFi quite a bit. So I'm very excited for this interview. I've been waiting to talk to this man for quite some time. I'm going to leave it to him. On with the show. Here we go. Peter from Audio Note. Today's episode is brought to you by Expona 2024. America's largest high-fidelity audio show takes place April 12th, 13th, and 14th at the Schaumburg Convention Center near Chicago, Illinois. Plan a trip to the Windy City this spring and discover over 190 listening rooms of high-end audio equipment and explore the latest in headphone hi-fi and Expona's ear gear experience. Tickets are available now at expona.com. That's www.axpona.com. Our friends at ZMF Headphones are sponsors of today's episode. ZMF is a curated collection of various sounds and styles in the form of dynamic and planar magnetic wood headphones, designed by founder Zach Merbach since 2011. ZMF has garnered an A+ recommended component in Stereophile, Headphone of the Year on Headphonics.com, and been a 2-time winner of the SBAF Golden Schlong Award. ZMF Headphones. That's the letter ZMF. Headphones.com. ZMF Headphones is the place to go to check out ZMF's collection and learn more. ZMF, traditional craft and modern acoustics. Before we get started, please introduce yourself, because I don't want to get your last name wrong.
My name, well, yeah, well.
I've heard it. Here's a compliment to you. I've heard it spoken as someone I need to talk to more than I've seen it written. So And then I was doing a little prep for the interview, and I saw how the last name was written, and I was like, well, I don't want to. Peter from Audio Note. How do you say?
From Audio Note. Well, my surname is actually very, very ancient.
Okay.
There are 76 males in the world with my surname.
Wow.
So it's also quite rare.
Yeah.
It's Danish.
Okay.
And it originates from sometime in the 11th century from a family dispute over who the oldest son was supposed to marry.
Oh, really?
And the parents wanted him to marry somebody, and he didn't like that somebody, so he decided to elope with the girl he wanted to marry.
Oh, really?
And his mother gave him a bag of gold coins. So when he left, he moved to a different part of Denmark, and he bought a very small holding, and it was by a river, or by a creek. We don't have rivers in Denmark, country it's not big enough. And the farm was called Qvortrup farm. And that's where my surname comes from. He just took that. His original name was Bugge, B-U-G-G-E. That would have been easier for everyone. Never mind.
So you were born and raised in...
I was born and raised in Denmark. I moved to Britain in 1983. And then I had a brief spell in the US for about 6 months where I worked in California. And I moved back to Britain.
Maybe this is too far in your past, but for the listeners, there's this thing that I've been reading about that the Danish have unique to their culture, at least I'm told, that the idea of hygge. Are you familiar? Am I saying it properly?
No.
No.
It's called hygge.
Hygge.
Hygge. And Danish is a very, very difficult language. I have 3 kids, and only one of them, we managed to have enough money to send her to school in Denmark for a year, and she learned to both speak, read, and write Danish. The other 2, the older 2, they can't. And Danish is a very, very difficult language, and because it's pronounced very differently from English. And I think there's a general resistance from English-speaking people to learn to speak any other language.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's laziness or intellectual.
Oh, it's 100% true. Unfortunately, the high school I went to didn't even require a foreign language, but that's the middle of America, you know. They think that they're the middle thinks that they're the center of it all. So.
Well, what is it? Is it 70% of the U.S. population hasn't got a passport?
Oh, yeah.
It's something like that.
Oh, and you meet them all the time. But this idea of...
Hygge.
Is it a real thing? What is it?
It's very much
exactly?
part of a sort of a social thing in Denmark, where you get together friends and you share food and you have a few drinks and you might sit and listen to some music or watch a film, or you do something together. And Denmark is I've lived in England now for close to 40 years, and having travelled over here a great deal over the years, what the English-speaking world lacks is a kind of social glue. That means that people are, we got lots of parties. We've got proportional representation in the UK, in Denmark, and that means we have lots of small parties. If you get 2% of the vote, you get 4 members of parliament. And that means we got quite a few parties in Parliament. And this expresses itself in various ways. But I think one of the ways it expresses itself is that there's a platform for everybody with different opinions.
Which can be good and bad.
Which is very difficult to fit within a 2-party system. Because you end up with very polarized opinions within the same party. And that makes it difficult to get any kind of consensus, as is amply, I think, demonstrated at the moment, both in the UK and in the US. But when you ask people on the street, no matter who they vote for, there is a general agreement on what kind of society they want to live in. the question we always ask ourselves is, imagine a society. Well, imagine what kind of society you would like to live in if you don't know what part of the social spectrum you come from. And the answer to that is very, very different from the answer when you know which social group you belong to.
Oh yeah.
And again, that I think there is general, I wouldn't say disdain for wealth, but there is wealth in Denmark is generally not displayed the way it's similar in Germany actually, and in one or two other countries in Scandinavia. This sort of ostentatious overconsumption and so on is frowned upon.
Not so in LA. I mean, I'm from Los Angeles, and again, I'm from the Midwest, and there's a little of that. There's maybe not as much disdain, but it is the complete opposite in Los Angeles, where they have an expression, fake it till you make it, which basically means for a lot of people who come there from another place, spend all the money you have, run up all the credit cards, and if it doesn't work out, move back home with your parents. It's completely the opposite.
Well, from my particular perspective, I don't think that's a desirable sort of structure.
No, it's not sustainable, certainly.
Of a society, and it certainly isn't sustainable either. I mean, it creates a lot of people that are losers. And the more losers, I mean, the most dangerous periods that societies go through are when you have a large production of, or large population of relatively young men that don't see themselves as having much of a chance for anything.
Yeah.
That's when you tend to get major problems and increases in violence and so on. Yeah. And of course here you can buy a gun, which we can't in Britain, which certainly has its benefits as far as that's concerned. But that's a more complicated conversation.
One of the things, I'd like to talk more about you, but one of the things I wanted to put up at the front of the program is really two things about the company, the brand. The first being, I feel like AudioNote is one of the few companies that kind of presents itself as a solution from end to end in their audio products. Is that a conscious effort by you to control every aspect? Do you worry about how your stuff pairs with other stuff? Is the company designed to have products that are flexible?
That's four questions. Firstly, it's deliberate. And it's deliberate because when I started out in the late 60s when I was a student. I built my own system with a pair of louder speakers, and I built a pair of Ace horns, Edward Michelson Ace horns. There were drawings in HiFi News and Record Review of those. I found I was given an old, I can't remember what the hell the amplifier was called now, but I sort of cobbled together a system. And from then on, I sort of, when I went to university, and we get nice big loans in Denmark. University is free. It still is. My daughter's over there studying at the moment. In fact, they pay you to go to university because otherwise you can't live a decent life, because the theory is that if you have to work and study at the same time in order to fund your university, you are not getting the full benefit of the free tuition. Mm-hmm. We have a saying in Denmark that a country that does not, or a society, should I probably say, that does not educate its youth has no future. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't invest in the raw material, because that's essentially what the younger generation is, they are the future material, therefore they're the raw material when you start with them. And you simply won't have a society that's worth its salt. And if you look at Britain and America, for example, what you have are two countries that tend to steal highly educated people from other countries. And that means that they're not having to pay for their education. Mm. So they get that for free. Mm-hmm. And this is a part of the system that we live in that I think is very problematic. I can give you an example. Mauritania in Africa, in West Africa, has a nurses' college that brings out, I think it's 22 nurses they train a year. In the last few years, Britain has imported half of those nurses. So here is one of the poorest countries in the world, educating a tiny number of people and paying for that, and then being deprived of them. That is a kind of wealth transfer that, as far as I see it, is totally unacceptable. And it's only one of a vast number. I can rattle this off for hours.
Sure.
So, all these sort of social aspects are whatever they are. But let's go back to audio. What I discovered relatively quickly when I started playing around with different equipment, when I started making some money, was that things are very badly matched. I started going to HiFi shows in the mid-'70s because I thought this was very interesting. I worked as a commodity broker for a couple of years. And then I went out and I started my own thing when I was 26. And I've been doing that ever since. I don't know whether that demonstrates mental illness or what that demonstrates, but it certainly demonstrates something. I very quickly realized that from speaking to people that made speakers and people that made amplifiers and people that made various other parts of the system, that they had really no idea and in many cases no interest in the other branches of the system. And I always thought, well, that's kind of strange, but maybe there are some sort of ground rules that means that a man that makes amplifiers can make an amplifier that works with a lot of different speakers. The more I've learned about this, the more I've come to realized that there is actually, that's not the case. They're very badly matched. And so here's the question. How do you judge the sound of a newly designed speaker? If the amplifier and the front end you're using are made by somebody whose understanding and aesthetic and, other choices don't match yours, which they are very, very, very unlikely to do. So what you get is basically a kind of mediocrity, a conspiracy of mediocrity throughout the system. And this is where all this talk about synergy comes from. Because they all talk about synergy. But when you ask people about, well, what does that mean? I mean, how does that, that it works together. Yeah, but what does that mean? And they don't know.
Yeah, it's almost
and
mystical.
I when I started investigating this, I started looking both at the history of audio and where a lot of the ideas came from. And part-time audiophile were silly enough, whatever, to print an article I'd written that Rafe Arnott got out of my cold, dead hand. I've been writing that article for years, and I wasn't happy with I kept rewriting some of the latter aspects of it. But when you study the history of audio and the technologies that were used, and you look at the discussions that were had at the junction points between the Edison cylinder and the flat disc and the acoustic recording systems, and when the electric recording systems came in the mid-1920s, and then when the tape recorder came out, the warnings about now you cannot judge a recording for what it is because you can change it. So you can create the illusion of a greater performance than the performance really was, because you can take out the bits that the conductor or the musician or whoever it was didn't like, or where they made mistakes. And that sort of interferes with a kind of time continuum that interferes with the authenticity. And of course, fast forward to now, I mean, now we can change everything. But the end result is that what we make is of generally very poor quality. I'm talking about classical music here. I'm not talking about, and less so jazz, because jazz is more free in a way. But in pop and rock and so on, and it's not that there's not great music. I love a lot of this stuff. You can come to my room and I play a lot of it. But I think that this idea that you can just it's kind of an attitude to reality, that you can just change reality. And I think that's, there is something dangerous about that. Because if we start becoming more and more incapable of hearing reality for what it is, or seeing reality for what it is, read up on it, then it also affects our ability to solve problems. Because if you do that, you are essentially moving the goalposts in a way that makes it more difficult to identify the root cause of a problem. And this applies in audio as it applies in economics and lots of other areas. I mean, a lot of science now is based on the idea that here's the answer, what does the question need to be in order to get this answer?
Okay.
And that's ideological.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of this kind of ideology in audio as well.
Yeah.
Where we need to have low distortion is very important. But then you look at how do we achieve the low distortion? And the way we achieve the low distortion is by some kind of delayed time reversal, which is a feedback system, or an oversampling system in digital. And you can't reverse time. You can't. Once you interfere with that, it doesn't work. And the industry is so hooked up on this idea that these numbers matter.
Right.
Well, I'll give you an interesting example. I went to Japan with a journalist in I think it was '92. With the intention of showing them doing some interviews of some of the people at the high end in Japan, which was very, very, very different, and still in many ways is, to the high end we have in the US, and particularly here, but also in Europe. And we went round, and we got, Sony somehow found out that we were there. So we got invited to go to Sony's research lab. And we went and saw research lab, and they were incredibly impressive. I mean, the equipment they had and the people that worked there and their understanding of the subject was really quite impressive. For a big company to invest resources in something like that, you wouldn't see that in the West, generally. So, but there, they at the end of it, we went down, there was a bar at the bottom of the building somewhere. Nice. So we went, and I think it's quite a social thing as well. Yeah. That all the co-workers, they meet and they sit and discuss today's affairs, and then they go home. And you can have a glass of sake or a glass of beer or whatever it is, and as long as you don't drink too much, you don't get done for drink driving. I don't think people take the underground, they don't really drive. But there we met the man who designed the 16-bit system. And he was quite interesting. He was retired by then. He had retired sometime a few years earlier. And his English was a little bit limited, but we asked him a few questions, and one of them was, so what music do you listen to? I listen to classical music. That's very nice. I listened, and then he says, I listen mono.
He listens in mono?
He listens to mono recordings.
Okay.
Okay, well, good so far. And we said to him, what do you? Which format do you listen to? You listen to CD or LP? And he said, LP. And then he said, no. Then we asked him, so why? He said, LP for music, CD for commercials. I thought that was a fine statement. I have it on tape. And then I asked him, so why 16-bit? And this is the most interesting answer I've ever come across to this question. He said, 16-bit is the, what the hell was the word he used? Is the optimal equilibrium between noise, distortion, and bandwidth. He said if you go up in sampling rate, you get more noise, better bandwidth, and worse dynamics. If you go down, it's for 14-bit, for example, you get better dynamics, lower noise, but higher distortion. And of course, lower bandwidth. So that kind of made me think that I ought to investigate, because we were looking at that time at making a DA converter. Because I eschewed anything digital until about 92, 93. Because I always felt that it really wasn't, I didn't like the sound of any of it. I thought it was just horrible. And I have a big enough record collection not to have to go and buy anything. Yeah. But I then ended up with looking at this. I thought, I spoke to my engineer at the time, and we agreed that we should, try and see if we can make a 16-bit converter. So we went and we got the Burr Brown chip, and we built a converter. And then when we got to the point where we looked at the load on the secondary, on the output of the chip, I suggested that can we try a transformer? I'd be interested to see what a transformer does, because a transformer is a dynamic load. It's not like a resistor capacitor. So we did that, and that worked really, really well. So we took a patent out on it. We got the patent runs out in next year or something. Which we've had it for 25 years. I think that's more than enough. I think patents and trademarks are one of the big issues in the modern economic system.
That they stifle creativity in a way?
I think a patent is a form of a property right. And I think one of the big problems we have in the world now is that property rights are getting in the way of climate development, for example, or it gets in the way of eradication of poverty. It gets in the way of all kinds of things. And nowhere do we have stronger property rights than in Britain and America. Because America is in many ways an extended version of what Britain was in the 18th century. You have a very similar electoral system to the one we have. So but it's. Essentially, the reason I've ended up making complete systems is that I cannot see a meaningful way of combining different design principles where the time constants and the gates between the different parts of the system are not very carefully calculated to match each other. Nobody would buy a car which had a gearbox from Mercedes, an engine from BMW, suspension from Audi or whatever. They would. I mean, who the hell would buy something like that? When you look at how cars are designed, the gearboxes are the gearbox ratios are very carefully designed so that they match the torque curve of the engine to optimize the efficiency of the overall system. And what we have in audio are these, profoundly crude systems where people, you stick more and more drive units in the speaker, and then you can charge more for it because more is better.
Always, without exception.
You make an amplifier that's 200 watts, and then you make one that's 400 watts, and the 400 watt one is much more expensive than the 200 watt one, which is much more expensive than the 50 watt one, irrespective of the fact. And then, of course, with price comes quality. There has to be better. The 200 watt one must be better than the 50 watt, simply because it's twice the price.
Right.
That doesn't make any sense as far as I'm concerned, because in order to get the higher power, you have a hell of a lot more parts in there, which means the signal passes through a hugely greater number of parts. Now, how does that make it better? Every single resistor, capacitor, valve or transistor you put a signal through has a negative influence on it. There's a logical disconnect here which doesn't seem to have occurred to people yet. And I find that really odd. This was how we ended up making very small, low-power amplifiers. Because I listen to things. This is how I got into the industry, was because I'm a major record collector. I have tens and tens of thousands of records and CDs. You're welcome to come to Britain and see them. So I come in from an angle where I really don't care what the dogma says. If you try and match the dogma to reality, and the dogma doesn't fit, then the dogma's wrong. It's real simple. It's a bit like I did economics at university, and I sort of followed the field of economics since then. And the way that economics is taught at university now, it's completely mathematized, and the mathematics are based on assumptions that have nothing to do with empirical reality. And audio is very, very similar. I find it really interesting that and some of it's in the language we describe sound with, because the language is quite mechanical. We talk about treble and mid-range, and how do you separate that? When an instrument moves from the bass through the mid-range into the higher frequencies? It just doesn't make sense to me. And it may be that I'm intellectually deficient, I don't know, but I come from a country where we have a very specific sort of sense of reality. And it may be partly in the language, that it's simply, it's easier in the Danish language, or in the German language for that matter, of talking about things and identifying problems. The English language has, in my opinion, the problem that it's quite indirect. People get really offended if you talk to them directly.
You mean like on the street, or
no,
in a fashion?
Listen to the discourse in the political sphere.
Yeah.
It's more blah, 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 and very little. Exclude all the lying and the alternative truths and all this sort of crap. But look at the way that problems are debated. They're very often, mostly debated from some kind of ideological vantage point. And that's very similar to audio. If you have a product that doesn't conform to the technological dogma of whatever the time you're in, then it doesn't, people don't, it's criticized. I mean, I've, and this isn't deliberate on my part. I mean, some of it is. I quite like to provoke it. Provoking is kind of funny and entertaining. But it is also the fact that, when we brought out the DAC with no oversampling, for example, every technical reviewer that reviewed it screamed to high heaven about the fact that, you got all these outer band noise and you got this and you got that. And then the question is, okay, so you can measure it. But you can't hear it. So if you can't hear it, what is it you can see on the measurements? Maybe what you can see on the measurements is a product of how you measure it.
Yeah.
And it actually bears no reality, no context in reality.
That is a problem, yeah. It can be a problem. It's not always a problem. But
Well, it with a lot of the measurement techniques we use, it certainly is a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, we've just introduced a field coil loudspeaker, and which has taken about 6 years to develop and perfect, and cost somewhere probably $500,000 to do the development. So we have to sell quite a lot of them to get our money, to get our money back, which is fine. I can live with that. But we make now speakers with ferrite magnets, that are the cheaper versions, and Alnico magnets, that are the more expensive versions, and now with field coils, that of course are the most expensive version. And when you compare the three, because we make them in exactly the same format, exactly the same size driver, exactly similar crossovers, so all the parameters are the same. So you can sit down and you can listen to them and you can say, what is the influence of the magnet system on the sound?
Yeah.
And the influence of the magnet system is very, very clear. The ferrites are not as good as the Alnico, and the Alnico sounds positively like it's got a flat tire when you compare it to the field coil. And it's kind of ironic that the first magnetic system that were used in moving coil loudspeakers was a field coil. When Kellogg and Rice took out their patent, and when was it, 1924 or something, on the moving coil loudspeaker, it was based on a field coil. So here is the very first technology developed for this system that has been completely abandoned, mainly because of cost, because it is not cheap to do.
Yeah.
But we now have loudspeakers that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they all share the cheapest magnet systems.
Yeah.
So the question is, where does the cost element that justifies the price come in? Because you can't adjust away in the shape of the cabinets or in the materials used in the cabinets or in the components or the design of the crossover. You can't design away the weakness in the magnet system. That's not possible. That will always be there, no matter what you do with the extraneous things around it. So it's again, I find it interesting that this is never discussed by the audio press. None of this is ever, no manufacturers are ever hauled up. Well, actually, apart from me. Because I get hauled up for making expensive products and they're not justified and so on. But if you ever go to the factory and you see how things are made by hand, then you'll have a better understanding of what's involved. And therefore the justification of the price is perhaps a little bit less negatively critical.
Sure.
Yeah.
Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is sponsored by Music Hall. For over 25 years, Music Hall has designed and built high-value, no-nonsense turntables. Audiophiles are told the more they spend, the better it gets, but Music Hall believes you can get great sound and build quality without breaking the bank. Their newest model, the Music Hall Stealth Direct Drive Turntable, was just awarded Part-Time Audiophile's 2023 Best Value Award. Editor Mark Phillips wrote, "It didn't take me long to realize a Music Hall Stealth turntable was a bit of a miracle. A great sounding direct drive table for a crazy low price." Music Hall remains a steadfast advocate for quality and affordability. Whether you're looking for your first or your last great turntable, do yourself a favor and visit musichallaudio.com to find your nearest authorized dealer or to order online with free shipping and a 30-day money-back guarantee.
I'm just going to start my second question here with a story. So, again, I wanted to kind of address something that I think stands out about when people think about AudioNote when they're first introduced. So my first introduction to AudioNote outside of what I had seen at the shows was actually at Ray Farnot's apartment up in Canada. He had a pair of AudioNotes. The AudioNotes were stuck in the corners.
Yeah.
And they were towed in to a degree where most of the listening position was beyond the two areas that crossed. And I immediately pointed this out because it was my first experience with this. And he and I got into a little bit of debate about what should be done, and he was very confident that they were set up absolutely perfectly. I would like if you could just explain a little bit to those who aren't as familiar with AudioNote what maybe he was talking about, how your speakers should be set up. Obviously, every room is unique, but maybe where this idea originated or how it came to be.
Well, I mean, the idea to put the speakers in the corners actually came from a mistake I made on a drawing when I sent drawings to a new cabinet manufacturer.
Okay.
And I made the port dimensions too small. The diameter of the port was too small, because the original port dimensions came from the Snell Tie B. Mm-hmm. In the case of the speakers you heard at Rapes, and basically I got the speaker cabinets back. I matched the drivers up to the crossover, and then I realized that when I took the port tubes that we were normally using in the production, they didn't fit. So I thought, anyway, so I just put a piece of cardboard tube in there of the same length. And then I set them up in my room. I've lived in the same house now for 39 years, and the room, I'm incredibly fortunate in that it's an old Victorian house and very solidly built. It's got suspended floors in on ground floor, and it's not particularly big, but it's big enough. So I stick the speakers in where they would normally sit, and I noticed that there's quite a lot of lack of bass. And at some point, I moved the speakers closer to the corner, and then suddenly the bass improved dramatically. Not only the amount of bass and the lower, and what should we say, they moved down in frequency. But what also happened was that there was kind of an elasticity in the bass that I'd not heard before. Well, this is kind of interesting. So I spoke to my designer at the time because I can do a lot of things, but I'm not technical enough or confident enough in my technical ability to sit down and recalculate the port dimensions based on the smaller So what should the length of the port be when the diameter is this?
Right.
So anyway, he recalculated it, and we decided that we needed a slightly different length of port. So we put that in, put them in the corners, back in the corners where they were, and hey presto, suddenly there was a kind of bass that I'd never heard from the speaker before. And that made me think, well, this is kind of, I mean, a lot of these things are done empirically. You can't really measure these differences in the traditional way. So I basically started experimenting with how close into the corners the speakers needed to be for certain port dimensions, both ways. And this went on for a couple of years. And then I ended up with the port dimensions that we've essentially got now. The benefit of having the speaker in the corner is multiple. It was well known in the 1920s and early 30s that if the sound emanates from the room boundaries, the room has a lot less effect on the sound. I mean, if you look at the modern speakers, they have to be out in the middle of the room. They have to be away from the walls. They have to be this. And that causes a number of problems. I mean, one of them is domestic with your wife. She goes, "You're not fucking putting those there." I don't want cables all over my floor. The kids are going to fall over there in them. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that it creates an enormous amount of problems with the room and the room's reaction to when you put sound into it at different volume levels and so on. And that we now have an entire industry that makes room correction systems of various sorts, both physical and digital, all of which are pretty much unnecessary if you design the speaker to be close to the room boundaries. I mean, if you look at in the 1950s and 60s, Allison, for example, designed speakers that were designed to sit in the corners. The Klipschorn was designed to sit in the corners. I mean, the Klipschorn, if you take a Klipschorn out the corners, it's got no bass whatsoever. Right. It hasn't got very much bass in the first place, but if you take it out the corners, it's got none. But there were lots of speakers like that. In that, Philips made corner speakers, and quite a lot of companies made them. So it was well recognized that corner position and close proximity to the room boundaries is beneficial. Now, what you get from a speaker like ours is you get a 3 dB boost in the bass for every surface. So you get, basically, if you get them correctly positioned in the corner and you've got hard walls, not made of cardboard, then you get 9 dB boost in the bass. Wow. And that means a speaker that in free field is about 45, 50 hertz roll off is now goes down to 15, 16 hertz. And to do that with an 8-inch woofer is pretty amazing. Right. Because you've got much greater agility, stop-start ability in a small woofer when it's well coupled to the cabinet. And I can thank Peter Snell for that. This was not my invention. I will state this for as long as I can. That the coupling to the cabinet is in Peter's speakers were probably about the best you can physically do within the limitations of materials and so on. So you end up with a speaker that basically is quite small, that's also quite efficient. The basic A&E is about 94 dB. The high efficiency versions of them are 97, 98 dB. But again, with conventional measurement methods, you can't measure that as efficiency the same way that we do. So the other advantage of the corner position is that you sum the first reflection and the direct sound, and that has to do with the angling of the speaker. You can also tune out standing waves in the room, if the room has got, and some rooms do. I mean, concrete buildings are particularly bad at this because concrete is a very homogeneous material, so it tends to vibrate at a given frequency quite badly. Whereas if it's made of brick or it's made of a combination of wood and brick, for example, it doesn't. It's uneven enough in its behavior to cancel it out. I can give you the name for that. It's called the damping by differential masses. You can't resonate two things with a different mass at the same frequency. They will cancel each other out. The best example of this, by the way, are the buildings that the Incas made and the earlier civilizations in South America along the Andes. You will see that they always have stones of different sizes. They get a lot of earthquakes. Those buildings don't fall over in an earthquake because they cancel out the energy from the resonance of the earthquake. And they knew this 3,000 plus years ago. You know, we're not as smart as we think.
I know. I mean, there's thinkers in every time period. It's just using the tools that you have.
It's also, we've lost to a large extent, I think, in a number of disciplines, scientific disciplines. Not that economics is a science, because it isn't. We've lost the ability to, take empirical data and draw conclusions from them. Because we get into there are all sorts of dogmas and things. Well, this isn't how it should be. But you shouldn't be interested in what you think it should be. You should be interested in is what it is.
Right.
I mean, if you look at 19th century science, you observe, you test, you observe again, you test, you give it to other people, they test it. If they don't come up with a similar result, you go back to the drawing board again.
Yeah.
This isn't how a lot of things are done these days. Anyway, so where are we? I tend to go around in circles.
No, it's all right. I enjoy the departure. We do talk a lot of technical audio on this show, but I very much enjoy hearing people's opinions about other things, their personal stories. I think that you've touched on a lot of interesting things. One of the talking points from last season was something you already touched on. And the question was formed more like this than kind of how you approached it, but is there a specific sound to high efficiency? Because I interviewed a couple of different guys that make high efficiency speakers, and then there's obviously the enthusiasts that you talked about as well, who love, you generally in the audiophile circles, more tube-based, low wattage, high efficiency speakers. And I think that some feel that in and of itself, high efficiency has a particular sound or characteristic. And it's been proposed that maybe an amplifier that's pushing out things at a more upper level might sound more better or saturated or whatever word you want to use. Better sound comes out when an amp is pushed a little harder than if you have a ton of wattage and we're just at the bottom cusp of this capability of the system and we're running it low. So you got to turn it up louder to get better sound.
I mean, again, it comes back to what I said about taking a holistic approach to the whole system. And you look at every gate, every junction point, every the time constants between every stage in the amplifier or the DAC or the whatever. And then you try and minimize the amount of work the signal has to do in order to jump each gate. So you try and lower the gates as much as you can. Now, you can only do that in a system if you manufacture every single part. You cannot rely on other manufacturers having the same understanding of the importance of these things. I mean, one of the main advantages of the low power amplifiers is one, simplicity, because there are maybe two stages. I mean, we show an amplifier here that is 2 stages, power amplifier. It's got an input transformer, which is a virtual component. It's got a driver stage, which is a triode coupled 6V6. It's got a driver transformer, which again is a virtual component. It's got the output stage. It's got literally 2 resistors and 3 virtual components and 2 gain stages. I defy anybody to come up with greater simplicity than that.
Right.
Good fucking luck with it, because you won't be able to do it. Believe me, I've tried. So the fact of the matter is that all these stages are linear enough in themselves not to need any correction. And this is one of the key problems with pretty much every amplifier on the market, including a lot of the tube amplifiers, is that they have correction in them, they have feedback in them.
Yeah.
And some people will say, oh, if you only use the regional feedback, or if you don't do overall feedback, or you do feedback like this, or you've got an nonlinear tap, or you've got God knows what, then you won't hear the effect. Oh, yes, you will. Take it from me, I can demonstrate the effect of every single one of those. And it's not difficult to hear. Assuming that you then have other elements in the system that does not have other problems, that then conceal the issue there. And of course, this is where the speakers play a very important role. Again, we only make 2-way speakers. Getting a 3-way speaker, getting 3 drivers to work together coherently at different volume levels, different amplitudes, different frequencies, different frequency combinations, is borderline impossible. Again, Peter Snell worked out a way of doing this. He also made a 3-way, and I've looked at the 3-ways, and so far I haven't figured out a way of getting them to what I can make to match what Peter made. And I may never do that. I'm too old for that. I'm too old now, I think. Well, yeah, you get to, I'm past my 70s now, so there comes a point where you have to start saying, maybe going into a 15-year project might not be such a good idea, because you may not be there to finish it. That's just a fact of life. But, I think the time, again, it comes down to time constants. Where the woofer and tweeters work together or meet each other, they have to have time constants where they don't stop and start differently. Because one of the things our hearing system is extraordinarily good at picking up are these timing differences.
Right.
And I think that must go back to when we were hunter-gatherers and we were able to identify danger from other predators. Of course, man is a predator as well, which has been well proven by now, so that we could run away or figure out a way of defending ourselves. So that I think that's inherent particularly in the male part of the human species. But women have much better hearing than we have generally. And we have different sensitivity points in our hearing as well. And this is again something which is not well discussed and not well understood. Because we assume that our hearing is a simple linear frequency device.
Right.
And that it has the same sensitivity across frequencies. I got quite a good example of this. I have, when I started in the industry, I opened a shop in Copenhagen, which I still own. And upstairs lived an old gentleman who was the former chief cellist of the Copenhagen Symphony Orchestra. And he was deaf. And he could virtually not hear anything. He had hearing aids in those days, big things like this, looked like headphones. And he would come down, and you have to talk quite loudly, otherwise he couldn't hear what you were saying. And he had it fully turned up. But we used to have these listening sessions. I used to close the shop at about 1 o'clock on a Saturday, and then we'd sit and eat Danishes and drink coffee and listen to different things that had come in, or people would bring stuff in, and we would sit and listen and discuss it. And he would take part in this because he lived on his own. His wife had died many years earlier. And he would... I particularly remember one instance where I gathered 6 different cables together, interconnects. So what we would do is one of us would be the meister that changed the cables. And that would normally be me. And then each of the guys in the back room would go out and sit in the room individually. And then they would make a note about what they thought of each cable and rank them in. And then they would go back. They'd put it in an envelope and then put it on the table. And the next one would go in, do the same. And this old boy, he would go in and he would do this. And we had to play a little bit louder when he was doing it. But apart from that, it was the same. We would then go in and do a test. We would then look at open the envelopes and say, okay, so this is the better cable, this is this is that. And then we'd invite people in to say, sit down and say, okay, well, let's see if you can remember, if you have an oral memory.
Right.
That's good enough to remember what number 1 cable sounded like, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay?
Yeah.
So we would go in, and most could 3. The best I ever did was 5. The best the old gentleman did was 6.
Really?
And not only that, but you would cheat, and then you would take the cable out and then put the same cable back in.
Yeah.
And he would go.
And they were all cable C, the old trick.
And he would go, that's the same cable as you just played.
No. Wow.
He had absolutely perfect recollection, in spite of the fact that his hearing system was so poor. This begs a lot of interest. I mean, I've been thinking about this for years, and it's very difficult to reconcile with the way we look at our hearing and the way the hearing actually appears to work. Perhaps not in all circumstances. I don't know. I don't study the hearing as a job. But this was one example I've come across, and I've come across a couple of other examples over the years, where you cannot explain this ability with the conventional view of how our hearing works.
Now, the subject came up in an interview I did yesterday of our perception of, well, what do we hear below 20 hertz, and this idea with distortion, and it was proposed, similar to what you were saying earlier, that maybe it's possible that, if we were in the caveman days, we'd hear a waterfall, and it would create a sense of like a noise floor or distortion, but a predator might be coming through that sound, and that we inherently developed the ability to hear through the waterfall to hear prey. So how does that exactly kind of relate to our ability to hear things that we might not measurement-wise necessarily think we can hear?
One of the problems with digital is that at noise level, it has very low resolution, if any. And we then claim that digital has this enormous dynamic range, but it's only really measured from 0 dB, i.e. from the noise floor. I have seen tests, and I've spoken to, I actually had a friend who studied the human hearing for many, many years. He was a professor at the university in Stockholm. And he wrote a couple of quite controversial papers on how he thought the hearing worked, and he was severely criticized for this. And he was very risk adverse, this chap. He sadly died quite a few years ago from motor neuron disease. But I remember some conversations I had with him about this, where he said, well, really the hearing is like a dual differential device. It listens for change. So if you have a system that has a relatively constant distortion across the band, and the distortion doesn't dramatically change with amplitude, then you don't hear it. Because it doesn't change. But if you can have a system which has, on paper and measured, very, very low distortion, but the distortion changes with amplitude and with frequency combinations, then you instantly pick it up. Or most people do. I mean, there are people that don't, obviously, but those things, there will always be a spread, won't there? And what I experienced when I played around with different products, different people's amplifiers, different people's speakers, and so on, a while before I started making things myself, and for quite a long time after, is that you can very clearly hear the influence of the feedback systems and transistor amplifiers. They're very easy to identify. And you can quite fairly easily identify the level of feedback that the amplifier's got, because the higher the level of the feedback, the more it seems to have a tendency to move the frequency content up. So you get an imbalance in the sound. And depending on amplitude and the program material you're playing, it will either make that worse or it will be less audible. And I think, I've written a piece on, which is on the website, called The Negative Effects of Feedback, where I sort of, in my somewhat limited mathematical capabilities, try to explain these differences. The way I see it is that an amplifier with feedback, when there's no signal, has no feedback. The second the signal hits the input, the feedback is only engaged by the signal, because it has to reach the output in order for the feedback loop to be engaged. What that means is that the input sensitivity is the input sensitivity without the feedback, which means you can clip the input really easily. So if you have a loud signal going into an amplifier, which is the first signal that meets the input, you clip the input. Then you send the information all the way around the amplifier and deduct that clipped input from the next signal that comes in. And there is no feedback system fast enough to reverse time. So it will always meet a signal that's not exactly like the signal it's trying to correct. It will never be able to do that. It's impossible to do. Feed forward, but feed forward then has to guess what the next signal is, and that's not very easy either. So essentially what you have is a distorted signal being deducted from the input, which then changes the frequency content of whatever came in after. And this distorted input makes several trips as slowly as it decays and is then topped up by other input. none of which has anything to do with the signal that hits the input at any given time. And if you have no feedback in the circuit, you can very, very clearly hear that. There have been amplifiers on the market in the late 70s and the early 80s, transistor amplifiers that had no voltage feedback. Had a little bit of current feedback, some of them didn't. None of them were commercially successful. One, I think, because they were difficult to make, and two, because they displayed things that when reviewers got hold of them, they didn't like when they measured them, they didn't like the distortion characteristics or whatever. So, which brings me to the language we use to describe sound, which is wholly inadequate. In fact, it has its own feedback loop back to the people that make the equipment. Because you will try and emulate the sound of what the words tell you. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah.
And so it actually creates the more we talk about imaging and sound staging and all these other things, the more likely people are to design products that try to emulate that. I've never done that. I think it's a complete mistake. We use a system called comparison by contrast. The industry, by and large, uses a system called comparison by reference. And what does that mean? Comparison by reference means that you have a series of reference recordings that you believe you know what they sound like.
Yeah.
And the main problem with it is that you don't know. And you really, really don't know. So you're making some colossal assumptions about what the equipment is doing to this particular recording.
Right.
Comparison by contrast, on the other hand, is based on the idea that we really only know one thing about recordings. Apart from the music that's on the recording, of course, we know what that is in most cases. But there are recordings where we simply, we don't know what that recording sounds like at its core, because we don't know what the microphones picked up. We don't know what the influence of the microphone cables were. We don't know what the mixing desk or the tape recorder or whatever equipment was used to capture the sound. We don't know what its influence was on what we captured. As a result of this, the only thing we can say with absolute certainty is that every single recording must have an individual sonic signature that comes from what was used to create it. The room, skill of the recording engineer, position of the microphones, the types of microphones, all kinds of things like that. But that has to be laid down within the recording. So the way I've done this for many years and the way things are generally judged when we test new products or new ideas or new components or whatever, is that we will take 6, 7, 8, 10 random records, some of which we've never heard before. Put them on the table, turntable, or in the CD player. And then we'll play them. And then we'll make a judgment as to whether we think the difference between them, the individualization of the sound itself, that the equipment has done a better version of that or hasn't done a better version. Because the one thing we know about coloration and the interference of the equipment is that the equipment will do the same whether you're playing a jazz record, a classical record, or anything else. Its inherent coloration will manifest itself as a homogenization of the sound. And that then interferes with, to put it crudely perhaps, the art of the artist. Because it will diminish him ever so slightly. Because the fine aspects of his performance will be lost because the equipment is doing something that masks this. And this is proven. I started using this system in the early 80s. It actually came out of what I described earlier, these listening sessions we used to have in the shop. And it was discussed extensively between myself and a couple of my then customers. Well, they're still customers, actually. They're still alive. Thank God for that. But it really became quite clear that there were very clear homogenizing effects that some pieces of equipment had to a much greater extent than others. And we then wondered, well, how does that affect the sound? How does that affect our sense of authenticity of the performance? And here's an interesting thing. I'm playing a lot of 78 transfers downstairs. And I had a friend who died in 2014, lived in St. Petersburg, called Anatoly Lignitsky. And he developed a way of transferring information from 78 that's better than anybody's ever done before by any other means. He used a wooden stylus, amongst other things.
Sorry, wooden?
A wooden stylus, yeah. He did a lot of other things as well, which are very interesting, which I shall leave to my own knowledge. I mean, we give away one of the CDs, and we made a whole load of CDRs of these, where we can provide somebody with that if they're interested. What's very interesting is that when you judge the sound of equipment, or when we now judge the sound of equipment, it is in many cases easier to hear differences between different resistors, for example, or a different circuit change using a 78 from a CD or from a CDR than it is to do from an analog recording. I don't have a sensible theory on this. It's something I've wondered. It's something we started noticing about 6, 7, 8 years ago. I don't have a good explanation for it. I think the only possible explanation that I can sort of think of is that if you look at the path between the original event and an acoustic 78, it's unbelievably short. With an electrical 78 from 1924, 25, whenever the heck, 25, 26, I think the electrical recording started coming in. It's also very much easier to hear, but on the acoustic ones, there is something in the acoustic 78, even though it's got much worse bandwidth and a lot more distortion, and all kinds of other anti-audiophile elements that would make people slit their own throat if they had to sit and listen to it for too long. Not me, though. There's something there. We have no idea what it is. We have no idea. But it must be related to the fact that the event, the path between the actual instrument or voice and it going down into being put down to recording is so short. So this is an interesting intellectual problem. Try and work that one out. I can't think of any other reason because no other explanation makes sense to me. But it's very interesting when you play around with this. I bought Anatoly's entire catalog plus his hard disk recorder. I sadly didn't get his turntable and the amplification and stuff he was using because that had gone by the time I got hold of his daughter. But it was very interesting. It is very interesting to play around with this.
I feel like you've addressed a couple of misconceptions that audiophiles might have along this conversation so far. As we kind of near the end here, is there any outstanding items that you feel the collection of audiophiles kind of have a strong misconception about that you haven't addressed yet?
Where do you want me to start?
Just the biggest one. No. I know there's a lot, but what is this? You addressed 2 or 3. What is the next biggest misconception that you would like to say something about?
It's mistaking loudness for dynamics.
I say spend a weekend at an audio show and you will know what the hell you're talking about. It is insanely loud out there.
It's very loud and not very dynamic. We played I was having a coffee this morning before the show opened downstairs, and I got to sit at a table with a gentleman there, and I got talking to him about this, and he's a big Mahler fan. And I said, "Oh, so have you got the greatest Mahler 3?" And he said, "Which one's that?" I said, "Well, it's Leinsdorf, Boston Symphony, about 1967 or 66. But you don't want the American or the US pressed RCA version because it's Dynagroove and it sounds dreadful. You want the British version that was cut by Decca. It's still called an RCA, but it's cut and pressed by Decca. You want that one?" And he went, "Really?" He said, "Where can I hear that?" I said, "Well, I have a copy of it upstairs."
Of course you do.
So I always carry a copy of that with me for shows. So he came up and he sat and we listened to it. And what they managed to do is, which you can't really hear very well on the American pressing because the Dynagroove cutting system really did some very strange things to the sound. What they did with what they managed to capture are the really, really pianissimo levels that the orchestra plays for quite long periods of time, where you can just hear the drums, but you can actually feel the expansion of the power from the drums, even though he's barely touching the skin, and so on. I don't think that most audiophiles have systems that are capable of doing that. Because most of the systems that the high-end industry make have quite high inertia. And because they've got quite high inertia, and it doesn't matter whether they're efficient or not. Inertia has nothing to do with efficiency. Inertia has to do with when the sound hits the system, primarily the speakers, at what level does the speaker start moving and making recognizable sound? And this is not a question of how efficient the system is. This is very often a question of the choice of magnet materials, the choice of how the cones are designed, how the speech coil is designed, how good is the amplifier at very, very low levels. And of course, music starts from silence. There is nothing, and then there's sound. And this is where this thing, but it was me that introduced the idea of the first watt that's been widely copied by other people. And I mean, they're welcome to it. I think it's a very important statement to make that the first watt on an amplifier is the most important. If you don't have a good first watt, then it doesn't matter how much you can amplify the signal. The first watt determines how good the sound is, because it only gets worse from there.
Yeah.
That's how it is, whether we like that or not. But the inertia of most of these systems are very considerable. And as a result of that, they really struggle with the very low levels, which of course then in turn has influenced the way, if you look at the kind of speakers they use in studios, over the last 40, 50 years, those speakers also have a lot of inertia. And so what do? They raise the lower levels, and then they compress the higher levels. Because if they raised all the levels, the high levels would be too loud. The systems wouldn't be able to cope with it. I spent some time at the Qvortrup studio in France, which is Brad Pitt's studio. And they've got a couple of systems down there. One of them is the Dolby Atmos system, which is supposed to be able to play these absolutely ridiculous sound pressure levels, which will make you deaf literally in seconds. If you sat there, they will make your ears bleed. I don't quite know why anybody thinks that's necessary.
Yeah, right. That's what I was thinking. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should.
No, but I've got Jeff Goldblum in what's it called?
Jurassic
Park.
Yeah.
That's one of the great statements about, AI.
Yeah.
Should we do it? Is it sensible to do it?
Yeah.
I will refrain from making an opinion on that. But I have an opinion. I'll just say that. No, it's very interesting to see how the dynamic range, the actual range of recordings has reduced over the last 30, 40 years.
Oh, yeah.
And digital has had an awful lot to do with that, because it's now much easier to manipulate the levels within the recording so that you can just change. Oh, I don't think the oboe is loud enough, and we'll go, psst, and then we move the oboe up a bit.
Yeah.
It's rarely the brass. The brass is normally loud enough. There are lots of other things, the violas or something. But so we end up with these recordings that really are significant, dynamic misrepresentations of the real event. And that comes back to what I said about authenticity. They're not authentic anymore. They are some emasculated, reduced version, in many cases very bland version. Because a lot of the effect, particularly in classical music, is achieved through changes in level. A lot of the emotional sort of, whisper that you get from the soft passages, it is only powerful because you got the loud passages, and vice versa. So we're not, it's almost like a conspiracy of purpose or a conspiracy of stupidity.
Well, Peter, I just want to thank you for your very generous time today. I know you're a busy guy, but it's been very enlightening and very fun to kind of hear your take on things. So appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, you're more than welcome. It was good fun, and it really was.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions.
The Occasional Podcast and its original associated music is monitored, mixed, and mastered on the Focal Trio 6 BE studio monitors.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.